right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don Pizzette, back again with Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going, Ronnie?
I am incredibly excited. I understand that there's a possibility of a full house reunion.
No way.
Yes, in the near future, so.
The reunions, they always kill me, because there's always like one cast member who's gone crazy, so. We should have an IT Pro TV reunion one day. Do we have anybody that's been like entered into a psychological war?
We don't talk about it anymore, Don. We've stopped talking about those issues anymore.
All right, well, we're going to dive back into project management today, and this next couple of processes, it's kind of interesting, and let me just jump into my process group schedule here. It's kind of interesting because it's a little bit confusing. They blend together a good bit. So we've been going through our monitoring and controlling, and we did validate scope, control scope, pretty straightforward stuff there. Now we're ready to look at control schedule and control costs, and these are very, very important.
Right.
When we deal with a project, making sure you hit your requirements, that's pretty cut and dry. You either hit them or you don't, right? There's no gray areas. But when it comes to cost and schedule, it's a moving target.
Right.
It's constantly changing, really hard to keep track of. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the general process of controlling the schedule and controlling the costs. And we'll talk about how we do that, how we watch the numbers and the actions we can take to correct those. But a big piece of what the PMI calls for in doing these is what's called EVM, or Earned Value Management. And EVM requires a ton of formulas.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, they've never done it by hand, or they're intimidated by the math or whatever. It's really not that bad once you learn it. But what we want to do is we want to split that off into a separate episode. So for this episode, we're going to focus on the processes themselves, and then in our next episode, we'll go formula crazy, right? It'll be like Formula One up in here. So, or not. But so anyhow, that's what we're going to tackle with the next episode. But for right now, let's take a look at these process groups.
Right.
So we'll go ahead and start with schedule, right? Controlling our schedule, and just in a real general sense, what does that mean? Well, if you have a specific endpoint of your project, a date that you need to finish by, December 31st, 2015, we've got to be done by then, all right? How do we watch the activities being performed on our project to ensure that we're done by December 31st, 2015? You don't wait until December 30th, 2015 to decide, wow, I don't think we're going to make that date. All throughout the project, starting on day one of execution, you start monitoring to see whether or not you're going to be in line. And then hopefully you don't have to take any actions. Things go nice and smooth. But if things start to fall behind or things start to get ahead, that's when we step in, right? Now, before I jump into the process itself, let me just cover one other real important concept, and that's the concept of variance. I know I've used that word before, but I want to show you guys the PMI's definition of variance, and really what it is. Variance at its heart and soul, if you boil it down, is just the difference between what you plan to happen and what's actually happened. All right. So we might make a chart, for example, and I think I did this before the show. You'd think I had planned for this. There we go. Showing what our plan is, right? During the planning phase, maybe I charted out, and let's say that over here on the left is our budget, how much money we've spent. And over here on the bottom side, this will be how much time has passed. So I've expected to spend a certain amount of money across time till I get to the end of my project, and that's the total amount of money that I would have spent, right? So that's my plan. That's what we come up with in the planning phase. As our project goes on, we start to track that, and we set up our various time intervals. So maybe at month 2, and then at month 4, and month 6, or whatever our measuring interval is, we start tracking that expense, right? That money that we've spent. And we start to notice right here that we're getting a little bit over budget, and then we're getting a little more, and a little more, until we reach down here. We've got a huge difference between what's actually happening and what we planned for. And the difference between them, that's our variance. In this example, it would be the amount we went over budget, right? But in terms of time, right, because we're talking about schedule right now, this might be, here's your measurement of time, And here's the measurement of the amount of work we expected to get done. So I expected to have a certain amount of work done in my plan. And I find as we move along that I'm actually getting further and further ahead. And so when I look at my numbers right here, I can see this huge difference between the amount of work I planned to get done and the amount of work that was actually done. This is great, right? I got a lot of extra work done. Well, I probably need to go evaluate that and find out what's going on, right? Usually it's one of two things. Either one, people are cutting corners, right? So some of the work is not actually getting done or it's not being done right. Or two, more work is getting done, but you're paying for it. OT, extra people, or overtime, extra people, things like that. So while we might be ahead of schedule, our budget may be out of whack. We may be paying more to get there. So just because I'm ahead of schedule doesn't mean that's a great thing. I may need to go and revisit that and find out what's going on. So we have what we planned for, what's actually happening, and variance is simply the difference between the two. So when we talk about the control schedule process, what we're really talking about is measuring variance. What's that difference? And then taking actions upon it. All right, so for the schedule side of things, to do this, we need to gather data. And that data comes in as our plan, right? Your project management plan serves as your baseline. Your plan tells you what you should have achieved at certain dates, your schedule, that information, your work breakdown structure, it's all in there, the data that we need. Then our project schedule, which again, is part of our plan. Then our work performance data. The project schedule is what should have been done. The work performance data is what actually was done. Those are the two things that we need to compare, the difference between the two resulting in our variance, and now we know whether we're ahead or behind, right? It's pretty straightforward. And when you say it like that, when you just speak the words, it's not a big deal, but that was actually a formula, right? The planned value, or the planned work versus the actual work, you take one, subtract the other, and your result is your variance. That's one of the formulas that we'll see later on. There's actually a ton of formulas, but they're mostly common sense. So if you think about it logically, this stuff kind of snaps together. All right, we also have our project calendars. Now, notice how we've got a project schedule and a project calendar. What's the difference, right? Well, a project schedule is showing things like the work to be done at particular periods of time. It's not taking into account, in a lot of cases, the availability of our resources. We have to schedule our resources separately. So we may have calendars that are built around that. Holidays, other things like that. A holiday is not an activity in your project schedule, but it is in the project calendar as a period where work can't get done. So it's kind of a differentiator there. Now, I'll be honest with you, for me, I always get confused dealing with multiple sources, so I usually log holidays as an activity just to be able to track that a little more easily. But employee vacations, you don't want to track that as an activity, so those are scenarios where you'd still have those calendars. All right. Any other schedule data that we have, and that schedule data may include things like what resources are assigned to an activity and things like the times during a day where they work. If I'm tracking work and I say there's 8 hours of work scheduled for that day, I usually don't care if it's 8 hours performed all in the morning or all in the afternoon or spread between the two, as long as the 8 hours of work gets done. If you're in a construction project, it doesn't matter what time of day the work gets done as long as it gets done. But there are some scenarios where you're trying to coordinate resources and those times become very important. And so we may need to get all the way down into that with our scheduling data. And then our organizational process assets, that's the paperwork and other resources that our company has available, all those different things that we need to adhere to. These are all of our inputs. We're just gathering that data together to begin working with it. And the way we work with it, well, we've actually talked about a lot of these already. Performance reviews, right? We meet with the individual people, we assess the amount of work that they've been doing and their performance. Just because 2 people each work 8 hours doesn't mean you got 16 hours worth of work. If one person is an expert in their field, they might have achieved twice as much work as the other person. So, take something like Ronnie. In a past life, Ronnie, you used to work on cars,
I
right?
did.
And your car knowledge outstrips mine by far, right? Now, I know how to change the brakes on a car. So do you.
I do.
It would probably take, like an hour maybe to change brakes on a car?
Right.
I know the last time I did it, it took me darn near 4 hours.
Yeah.
And I'm not good at it, I had to figure it out. We both did the same activity, right? but it took me 4 hours where it took him 1 hour. So if we both worked 1 hour, he's 100% done. I'm only 25% done. So time is not necessarily the greatest reflection of somebody's actual achievement. And so in a performance review, that's what we're trying to break down. How much work did they actually get done in that amount of time? Our project management software, right? Tracking schedules, especially when you're getting tons of progress reports or work statements from all sorts of employees, can be really difficult to correlate all that data and put it together and get a big picture. And it's constantly changing, so you could be mired in paperwork the rest of your life if you tried to do it by hand. Most of us use software, right? I'll bring up Microsoft Project in the next episode and kind of show where it can make this stuff a lot easier. You start feeding in your data, your status reports, and it's letting you know what's behind or what's not coming up, and it'll do really all the formulas we talk about. It does all that stuff for us, so we don't even have to think about the formulas. It's really, really handy. All right, then, if we have a problem, right, that's where we need to step in with things like our resource optimization techniques, all right? And we talked about those in another episode, but just to kind of refresh, we have things like resource leveling and resource smoothing. And that's where we take our resources where I might have them scheduled to work 8 hours today and 8 hours tomorrow, but in order to meet some other needs of my project, I might smooth them out so they do, instead of 8 hours 2 days in a row, they do 4 hours 4 days in a row. And that frees them up with an extra 4 hours on those first 2 days to help another activity get caught back up. So you can start to smooth and level your resources to make room or free up people to work on other activities. Right? Those are some examples of resource optimization techniques. We also have modeling techniques, things like, what's a great example here? As far as like how we lay out our resources. Actually, I think I threw these in the notes as I get my brain freeze here. There we go. Our what if scenarios and simulations. So when we're looking at our environment and looking at that upcoming schedule and we see a problem and we want to fix it, the solution might not be there right away. And so we experiment, we do modeling, we add in a few values, we change some things, and we see how it affects the rest of the calendar. If you're doing that by hand, it's a huge exercise. It takes a lot of effort. But if you have project management software, it just takes a matter of moments. You plug in some alternate values and see what happens and get an idea of what's going to happen. All right? And then there's other things that aren't here in the notes, things like schedule crashing that we might do, and maybe we get extra resources, we throw money at our problem, I think is how I described it in the earlier episodes. You can do whatever it takes to get your schedule back online, but those are the tools that you have at your disposal to try and correct that. All right. Now, sometimes you might fall behind schedule, and it's not a big deal, because you may have leads and lags, right? Lead time and lag times that are available that compensate for that. So activity C starts to get a little bit behind, but activity D has a couple of days of lag time on it. So that's okay. It can get pushed back a little bit and it'll be fine. Remember how we calculated our float, our total float, and our free float, right? If you don't remember those, jump back to the scheduling section of the planning process groups. We covered a lot of that there. But in those scenarios, you don't have to act, right? But if there is no float available, if you're dealing with an activity that's on your critical path, it can't fall behind.
Right.
If that critical path activity falls behind, your whole project falls behind. And that's where we need to jump over to our other techniques. All right. I guess I got ahead of myself with schedule compression, right? Schedule compression, where we look for all the gaps in our schedule where we might be able to slide our activities closer together, or you may have more than one activity that can occur at the same time. And again, we discussed those in the planning section too. So you'll remember that's always available to you. You may purposefully not do schedule compression during planning to use that as a reserve. Now, you want to be upfront about that with the powers that be, when you set your schedule. But when the time comes where you're actually executing the work, you might find that you need to compress in order to meet your goals.
Right.
And then the last one is a scheduling tool. Again, some people look at this and say, well, I've got project management software, isn't that a scheduling tool? It can be, but it isn't always, right? Microsoft Project is a great example. If you've got the desktop version of Microsoft Project, it is an amazing project management program. And as far as arranging your employees, as far as resources, it allows you to track if they've been over allocated and so on. So it does a good job there. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't track anything outside of the project. things like sick time, right, and leave requests. It doesn't track activities that they're performing with other projects, right? You're really tied inside of that single project. So with Microsoft Project, you've got to go up to like Microsoft Project Server to really get the full scheduling functionality out of it. A lot of people instead will leverage a separate scheduling software, and we do that here. Our software, I can never remember the name of it, Easy Clocking or something like that. So we have a different scheduling software that we use outside of our project software, and it's just because that other software does great with our payroll system and tracking vacation hours and benefits and stuff that's specialized to that. So you may have a separate scheduling tool for that. Very useful if you're trying to arrange your resources to work in a certain time period and make sure you don't conflict with their schedules. All right, now as we work with our schedule, if everything is running as planned, right? If there's nothing wrong, then our only outputs here are going to be our work performance information, which I know I've said this over and over again, is just the way we interpret that work performance data. Our schedule forecasts, which will be good, right? If everything's going great, our forecasts will be fine. And then that's really about it. We won't even really need to do any updates other than updating our project documentation to show that progress has occurred. But if things are going bad, right? If we're behind schedule or ahead of schedule, if we're over budget or under budget, then we're going to need to generate some other documents, like our forecasts, all right? Forecasts are where we try and predict the future. We say, based on where we're at today, if we continue on like this, here's how we're going to finish. We're going to finish this much over budget, or this much behind schedule, or this much over, whatever it is. You find out what that's going to be like if you stay the course, right? And that's going to give you an idea of whether you need to correct or not. If you find that the deviation, the variance from the plan, is small enough to fit within your reserves, then you might not worry about it, right? You might just cruise along. You've got reserves to cover it. But if you have no reserves, or if you've exceeded the reserves, then you're going to have to take action, and the forecasts do that. Now, the way we do the forecasts, math. Lots and lots of math. So we're going to see that in the next episode, generating those forecasts. Right? Now, based on the forecast, if we do decide to take action, if we do resource leveling or smoothing, if we do schedule crashing, schedule compression, if we do any of those various things, those are going to result in change requests, right? We've got to change the activities inside of our project to accommodate our new scenario, and that in turn is going to require changing our baseline. So that's important.
And speaking of that changing baseline, right, there's a particular term that you'll find in the PMBOK every once in a while they call re-baselining, and that particular term there is usually our last effort, right? Once we've done all of these different things, we've tried it and we just realized there's no way this is going to come underneath anything that I try. We may have to do that, and so do remember that term.
Yeah, an example of where you'd re-baseline, let's say you had a deadline of December 1st, and you're behind schedule, and you do everything you can, schedule compression, crashing, you burn your reserves, you do everything, and you still can't hit December 1st, all right? Well, your project is slated to fail. So you go to the sponsor and you explain the situation to them, and you say, look, we're not going to be successful right now. We're not going to be able to hit that December 1st date. And the sponsor says, well, what can we do? And you say, well, if we could have a little more time, how about December 15th instead? If we had December 15th, we had those 2 extra weeks, we could finish and be successful. And the sponsor says, all right, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with December 15th being our new start date. When that happens, you do a change ticket. Change your finish date to December 15th, and then you rebalance your schedule, right? You move things around to fit within that window of time. Now, that change ticket becomes part of your new baseline. You've re-baselined. And sure, there was that December 1 date, your original baseline, but that's not what you're working on anymore.
Right.
Now you're working on baseline 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, and your new finish date is December 15th, and now your project is back on for success again.
Right.
It's part of that change management procedure. Now that doesn't happen a lot,
No.
where the sponsor's like, sure, fine, whatever. It is one of those things that creeps up though. All right. Otherwise, we have our standard outputs that we expect to see here: project document updates, project management plan updates, and organizational process asset updates. All right. Just remember that while this process is pretty straightforward and simple, right? We watch what's being done, we gauge it against what's happening, and we report on it. There are some very specific operations that we want to perform that center around earned value management. Now, the reason we don't want to cover it right now is twofold, right? One, we want to make sure we have the basic concepts understood without mixing in a bunch of math that gets people confused. And two, earned value management, EVM, it really works by aggregating schedule and cost together, combining the values. So you end up with this really neat kind of dashboard or measurement utility that, or what do they call them, KPIs, key performance indicators. You end up with these really cool indicators that are a mixture of the two. So we want to talk about schedule and cost, and then once we've got those concepts down, then we jump into the formulas. All right, but that's basically it for controlling the schedule. See what's going on, correct if you need to, otherwise let it ride.
All right.
All right, Ronnie, can you think of anything else on schedule that I'm leaving out?
Nope. Just remember that this particular process, even though we've gone through it a little bit more, you'll see in the section when we get into the formulas how we actually do this, and keep on top of it by using simple math here. But it does require some time, and you're going to actually have to do it every day. There's no way you can let this thing pass and go, okay, I'll worry about it next week. So, diligence is pretty much the key here, especially on time management.
Yeah, and that everyday part, that's where you really need project management software.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a challenge to do it every day. Yeah. All right, well, let's do this. Let's stop and take a break. And when we get back, we're going to take a look at the controlling costs process and how that works, and kind of wind through that. So stay tuned. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So now we're going to take a look at cost.
Right.
Cost is a lot easier to maintain and control than schedule. With schedule, you've got work and performance that you're trying to measure, and the only real way to interpret work is to ask people, hey, how much of the work is done? What percentage are you complete? And they say, well, I'm 30% complete, or I'm 50% complete. Well, how are they measuring that? A lot of times they're just pulling it out of their head. And they might say, I'm 80% complete, but in reality they've only done half the work or whatever. So it's very subjective. Schedule is a very subjective thing. But cost, you just look at the checkbook. You go to the bank account and you say, how much money have I spent? So it's one of the easier things to monitor because we have hard numbers that can't be denied, right? You've got that information. But there are some challenges to cost. When you talk about a job being done, as far as like schedule, well, 0% is the job hasn't started, 100% is the job is done. And when they're halfway through, you expect them to be 50% complete, right? So it's a nice even distribution. But cost is not always an even distribution. With cost, you might have an activity where you have to purchase some equipment on day one, and then you've got to pay labor for employees to work on it for day two, and so on. And when you track your costs that way on a day-by-day basis, you end up with something like a weighted front-end model or a turtle or whatever. It's the various diagram names for that, where you've got a huge spike in cost on day one, and then it kind of plateaus out. So it's not an even distribution. Let me go back to that variance chart that I drew earlier. So here I'm showing what would be more like schedule, right? I expect work to get done every day until 100% of it is done. That's what you expect with a schedule. And if people get ahead of schedule, it starts to jump up like this. But with a cost, that initial plan may be very different. Let me do a whole new chart here. All right. So with something like cost, if I've got a huge upfront cost, then my schedule or my variance may actually be a little more like this, where I'm seeing this big jump right here at the beginning because we have to buy that equipment, and then it levels out for the remainder because at that point we've already bought the equipment, we've got it, it's done, and off we go. So when I start tracking that as far as the performance of my individual work or whatever, I should expect to see the same thing. I should expect to see that giant upfront, expense, and then at the end, I should expect to see it end up, something like the same. But if something happens, maybe we don't order the equipment right when we're supposed to, and so that initial purchase happens a few days later, so I get that bump a little bit later. That should be okay, because I purchased the equipment, the labor gets paid, we still finish on schedule. So schedule might be fine, even though our budget's a little wonky there in the beginning. Now, I'll notice when I go and check the bank accounts and I see on day one or day two, I haven't spent the money, right? The money hasn't been spent. What's going on? We haven't ordered the equipment. It's a great indicator, right? Or if we see that they got the equipment on sale, so maybe it cost a little less than originally planned, then we might see a variance that's something like this, where you get a nice big jump, that big difference here, And that difference just carries through to the end of the project because you save the money at the beginning. So the variance is going to be there all the way along. Week after week, you'll see that same difference because you save money back on day one. All right. There are some scenarios where the reverse is true, where there's a lot of work up front and then you actually do equipment purchases at the end. So you see a sweeping model like that. But just be aware that cost is not always evenly distributed, and that can make it difficult to track. So don't assume that if an activity has a cost of $80,000 and it's an 8-day activity, don't assume it's going to be $10,000 a day, right? If you do that, your variance is going to be huge all the way up until day 8 when things level out, if all the cost is up front, right? So, if I assume an even distribution in my plan across 8 days, so here's my even distribution, but I buy the equipment on day 1, right? Well, now I've got this massive variance, especially like right in here in the middle. I've got this massive variance, and it slowly corrects itself. But if I'm just looking at the report right here on day 4, I'm looking at that report and I'm saying, holy moly, I'm over 50% over budget. Or actually, this is more like over 100% over budget. I've almost doubled what I had budgeted to spend here. So we have to understand that. If your plan does not incorporate that information, you're going to get bad numbers, and cost will be near impossible to measure until you're actually done with the activity, which is too late to do anything about it, right? Because what if I see that huge variance and I say, okay, well, I've got a huge variance, but you know what? I bet it's going to arc back down and we'll level out at the end and finish on schedule. But it doesn't, right? Then it just continues on growing, growing, growing. And sure, it comes back a little bit, but you still end up with a pretty big variance. Now you're over budget, right? There's no way to track that. So your cost, as far as tracking it, is only going to be as good as the original plan you set underneath it, your original baseline. So we make sure we set an accurate baseline to what our expenses are going to be, and then we track on that. And now when I start to see that variance, that deviation, I can see it, and I can spot it early on while I still have time to do something about it. I guess I don't really have enough room for arrows there, do I? But so I still have time to do something about it and get it corrected, and hopefully we can bring that back in line. So maybe we were paying unauthorized overtime, and we tell people, wait a minute, that was not authorized overtime, so you got to make that up to us. And the contractor says, okay, sorry about that, we'll get it back in line, and we'll cover the cost of some of the additional labor. And so now towards the end of the project here, sure, we had that little boost right here where there was unauthorized overtime, but wow, I'm just not able to grab my little pointer there. There we go. But they compensated for it out of their own pocket to bring it back in line towards the finish. So sure, we ended up with some variance right there, but at the end of the day, it sorted itself out. So that's what we hope to see, and we get things kind of put back. So when it comes to cost, it's not necessarily as cut and dry as looking at the bank account. We've got to make sure we've got a good plan. All right, so if I go back to the control cost process, we're going to see a lot of the same stuff that we saw with the schedule, right? Because it's the same idea. Our inputs, the project management plan, right? That's what's going to be containing all the activities that get performed and that information. My project funding requirements, right? That's a fancy way of saying your budget, right? You've got a budget, and the budget itself may just be one number. I have a project, it's a $5 million project. That's my budget. But the project funding requirements, that's where we map out what days, what weeks, what months we actually need that expense on. And we talked about that back in the planning episodes. You want to know when those expenses are going to be incurred, because you might not need all $5 million of that $5 million project on day one. So don't set it aside if you don't need it right away. So you can set it aside as time goes on. That allows companies to take on projects they couldn't afford all at once. So we need to know what those requirements are, what days, what months we need that money to be spent. That's going to give us our accurate data. Then we've got our work performance data. In scheduling, work performance data was really percent complete, how much work they had done. But here, work performance data is going to be what's called our actual cost. Actual cost is how much money you've spent. So I planned on spending $300,000 by month 3. How much have I actually spent? I've actually spent $300,000. I'm on budget, right? Or I've actually spent $250,000. I'm below budget. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, right? Or I'm over budget. We find that out really easy based on our actual cost versus our planned cost and what we expected to spend. And then our organizational process assets, in this case, it's going to usually be our bookkeeping, whatever resources as far as accountants, bank accounts, and financial reporting information that we have. On our tools and techniques, it's almost all math. And like I said, we're going to hold that for the next episode. But earned value management is a big part of it. Looking at what you've spent so far versus what you should have spent so far and determining whether you're over or under budget. And then trending that out to the future, the forecasting piece, to see what's going to happen as you go on. Right? Now, there is a series of numbers that we can calculate here that show us this. But one of the cooler ones that the PMI calls out pretty strongly is the 2 Complete Performance Index. All right, and anytime you see 2 Complete, we're going to see a lot of calculations that'll be, budget at completion, things like that, and then there's going to be budget to complete, and that means how much more money do we need to finish this project, or how much more time do we need to finish this project. So it'll give you that idea of what's coming down the line. So when we talk about the 2 Complete Performance Index, that's a percentage number, basically, that'll show how much more money or how much less money we'll need to finish than what we originally planned. And it's really just one piece of several other things. We have a Cost Performance Index, a CPI. That's where you are right now. 2 Complete is where you'll be when you finish. That's seeing the future, right? We've got our performance reviews. Performance reviews in the matter of cost is really just bookkeeping, right? Checking what was spent in the bank accounts versus what's been reported inside of our project and what was planned, and kind of correlating those numbers together and figuring out where we fall. And then we've got our project management software. You may have project management software that does all of this stuff for you and does a great job. I'll tell you, I've never had that experience though. Most project management software is not good financial software. Microsoft Project only recently, really in Project 2010, did they even start addressing monetary values of any real way. And they've gotten better in some of the newer versions, but at the end of the day, it's not accounting software. So it can do basic numbers and give us a general idea for tracking purposes, but it's not something you'd want to submit to the IRS for taxes or whatever. So, we need to make sure we keep that in mind, that our project management software might not be the perfect solution, all right? But it does give you a good idea, and in fact, if you're using Microsoft Project, if you feed it your financial data, it'll calculate out things like TCPI for you, so you don't even have to worry about the math behind it. All right. Now, one of the most important things we do when we're talking about controlling costs is reserve analysis. All right. If you set up a reserve in your planning phase to say, all right, I've got this amount of dollars set aside just in case we go over, or just in case certain risks occur. Well, when you did that, the reserve, those funds should be earmarked for those contingencies that you planned for, right? So no one should be drawing money from the reserve unless it meets or fulfills the requirements we specified when we set up that reserve, right? So if we're doing an outdoor rock concert and there's a chance it might rain, I might have set aside $10,000 in reserve so that if it rains, we can get those tents, okay? Well, as we come up on the festival, we realize it's not going to rain. It's the middle of a drought. It's not going to happen. We don't need that 10 grand. That doesn't mean we can go and use that 10 grand for something else. It means that the 10 grand was earmarked for tents. We didn't need the tents. We give the money back to the company. It wasn't used. All right. If you want to use it for something else, you got to do a change ticket. A change ticket to say, we want to reallocate this reserve to another area that's fallen behind or that needs help or that could be better with some extra money. And if the sponsor is okay with that, now you can reallocate the reserve. But it's not yours to do with as you please. It needs to be earmarked. If you don't do that, if you don't do a reserve system that's tracked and controlled, then it leaves room for impropriety, right? I mean, you
money
could be
disappearing.
You could be spending money on all sorts of crazy things. And that's something you absolutely want to avoid. There are a lot of people who do that in real life. Actually set up a reserve with no earmarks on it and just say, oh, I'm going to hold on to this money in case. And that may be fine for their company. On the exam, it's going to be the wrong answer, though. You want to make sure that's reserved. All right, so that's kind of the, some of the things that are involved there. Reserve analysis, you may not even be the one that does it as the project manager. If you have an accounting team or an accounts payable department or whatever that is controlling the funds, then they may be the ones that do it. And most of the environments that I've worked in as a project manager, I didn't have check writing authority for the company. So I couldn't just cut a check to somebody. What I would have to do is anytime I needed to pay out to a vendor or to a contractor or whatever, I'd submit a form. Submit a form to the accounting department saying, I'm Don Pizzette, project manager for this project, work package number, blah, 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 because we use a work breakdown structure number. And we'd say that code of accounts, that activity needs to be paid out to this vendor. The work was complete. The accounting department would review it, and then they would cut the check. And if I was trying to approve funds for something that wasn't predetermined, then they'd reject it and require more information, right? And I would have to get the sponsor involved to be able to achieve that. That's a very common scenario. In a projectized organization, though, you as a project manager might have check writing authority. And if that's the case, then it's all on your shoulders to make sure that money is being properly portioned out. All right, that leads us to our outputs. On the output side, just like on the schedule side, right? Work performance information. That's how we've interpreted our financial data and usually converted it into numbers that make sense. When we do all the formulas in the next episode, you'll see there's a lot of numbers that'll make sense to us because we just learned about them, right? But to the average Joe or your CEO or whatever, they may not know what those numbers mean. So we need to translate them into a way that is a little more understandable. We'll have our cost forecasts, so what things are going to look like in the future at our current rate. We'll have our change requests, if we need to take an action, if we need to tap into a reserve or whatever. You know, tapping into a reserve doesn't always require a change request. If you've already earmarked it for that contingency and the contingency happens, that's part of the plan, so you don't need a change request. If you're reallocating those reserves, that's where you'd need a change. Project management plan updates. Again, if you have changes that are going to result in a modification to the plan, you need to do that. Usually, though, what we're talking about here are more things like the risk register. So if a risk happens or doesn't happen, we enter that in the risk register, which is part of our project management plan. Any other project document updates that we may need to do, any accounting work that we need to do, and organizational process asset updates. Remember that, like when we engage in contracts and we pay out to vendors, that we generate a lot of documentation based on their performance, and we want to share that with other project managers so they can see how it happened for us and they can recreate that in their projects, and that's part of our organizational process assets.
Yeah. The overall goal for us here on the controlling costs a lot of times is not really just going, okay, I know things are actually on budget, which they're great when they are, but it's to actually be able to control any uncontrolled spending, right? So someone actually takes too much when they don't need to. We're not sure where the money's going. The whole goal of getting all of the information that we need here is that idea, so that we know exactly where it's going, because we're reporting to stakeholders and they need to know and we need to know too. So really that's the key behind all the numbers that we're facing.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so that in a nutshell is controlling the cost. The processes themselves are not that hard, but we left out a pretty big chunk there, didn't we, right? Items 1, 2, and 3. These are the math that we use. And there's common sense metrics that you can use for monitoring your projects if you want to go that way. But remember, you are working to become a project management professional as certified by the PMI, the Project Management Institute. And the exam is based on the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. You'll see how many acronyms I can throw out here. So they have a prescribed method for tracking this, a method that has been tested and proven across companies all across the world. And if you use those numbers, they're known to be reliable, well-founded, and scientifically proven numbers that you can count on, versus numbers that could potentially be modified or changed to reflect a situation differently than it is. So we're going to tackle that, but it is a lot. So let's do this, Ronnie. Why don't we go ahead and wrap this show here? This will be one of our shorter shows. And in the next episode, we're going to go formula crazy. And we'll see how long it takes, right? Depends on questions we get in the chat room and stuff. That may be a longer episode or a shorter one. We'll see. But I want to make sure that's separate so people can focus in on it. All right, well, if you have any questions on what we've talked about, be sure to ask. Live during the show, you can go to itpro.tv/live. You'll see the chat box right beneath the video. Post your questions there. We monitor and answer during the show. If you have questions after the show, use the Q&A forums. At the top of every page is a link that says Q&A. Jump on in there. You can post your questions. We monitor and answer there too. So take advantage of that resource. It is there for you. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we will see you next time.